If you're having any issues with the presentation or media player, please press F5 on your PC to refresh your screen. Today's presenters are Douglas Wolfson. Douglas is the Director, Financial Crime Compliance for LexisNexis Risk Solutions in Asia. Headquartered in Hong Kong, he drives the strategy and product development of the risk tools used by the biggest banks in the world that help to mitigate financial crime and compliance issues. Doug has 18 years of financial services, risk management, and international business experience. This includes leading risk management departments at the world's most recognizable financial institutions. Also speaking today is Nick Turner, of counsel at Steptoe & Johnson in Hong Kong. Nick works with multinational financial institutions and corporations worldwide on all aspects of economic sanctions, anti-money laundering, and anti-bribery and corruption compliance and investigations. He focuses on designing and implementing compliance programs and the application of regulations from the U.S. Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, and other agencies to clients' international businesses. Nick was recently named on the Global Investigations Review, or GIR, list of 40 under 40 global investigation specialists. Nick has also designed and delivered tailored trainings for clients on economic sanctions and anti-money laundering laws in the financial services, telecommunications, and manufacturing sectors, and is a certified anti-money laundering specialist, or CAMS. And now over to you, Doug. Welcome.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mary, and welcome everybody to the webinar. This is the third and final webinar in our Core of Financial Crime Compliance series. We're delighted to have you here. If you've been to one of the first two or both of the first two, we're delighted to have you back. Thank you very much. And in a moment, I'll have a chat here with Nick, who I'm really excited about having here. Nick is the foremost expert on OFAC sanctions here in Asia, and it's always good to chat with him. Just before we get to that, though, a reminder for you that although this is the final webinar in this series, we do have two more webinars coming up over the coming weeks. Next week, we will be exploring the global cost of financial crime compliance with my colleague in London, Nina Kirkez. And on July 2nd, we will be discussing the new regulatory expectations for virtual asset service providers with my colleague here in Asia Pacific down in Sydney, Cameron Church. So very excited about those as well. With Nick today and you know, talking about virtual asset service providers, it's one of the things we're going to be talking about. And it's really exciting now because obviously, you know, sanctions risk has always been there for companies since sanctions were invented. But it's become significantly more difficult to manage in this day and age with more and more technology and sanctions evaders able to hide behind it. So what we wanted to do is bring you a bit of a modern perspective on sanctions risk and how we're seeing risk in technology, in new technology, and primarily in regards to OFAC and extraterritoriality, I always seem to struggle with that word, of OFAC sanctions. And so we're going to be talking about technology and sanctions. We're going to be talking about OFAC and the USD, and then you know, making sure that we stay current and on topic. We're going to be talking about some Hong Kong sanctions risk that you know, that a lot of you in the region might start to be facing now that Donald Trump and the U.S. government has started to turn his gaze eastward or westward from the United States. But starting with cryptocurrencies and virtual assets, I guess this is a new invention over sort of the past 5 to 10 years, and I think there's been some real risk that's been added in terms of sanctions and sanctions evasions, money laundering generally, but it's a great way for sanctions evaders to get around a lot of the controls that are on them from a banking perspective. What do you see from a broad perspective as sort of the key risks around cryptocurrencies and sanctions evasions?
Sure. It's a really interesting area to think about. It's been highlighted recently by OFAC and other U.S. agencies. I think many of you saw a guidance document that came out recently about North Korea and the use of cryptocurrencies to circumvent sanctions. And this is an issue that U.S. Investigators and prosecutors have emphasized recently as a growing concern, not only with respect to North Korea, but other sanctions issues as well. Primarily, in the view of the U.S. government, the risk is emanating from a couple of features of the cryptocurrency environment. The first is the anonymous nature of it. And the anonymity here is a little bit counterintuitive because on the one hand, if something is on a blockchain, in theory, it's open, it's visible, and the transactions are not hidden from view because they're on the blockchain. So that's an interesting feature. But what we also have in addition to that is an environment where the virtual asset service providers may be operating in a variety of jurisdictions, many of which have weak regulatory regimes for this area, and they're not applying the stringent KYC and monitoring controls that you would normally see in, say, a traditional financial institution.
So what's really interesting about that, if you sort of start with the anonymity, and as you see on the slide, we put pseudo-anonymity up there because once you know who controls a given Bitcoin, you can follow the entire chain of that Bitcoin back to essentially its creation. But I guess that real problem is figuring out who's behind the string of letters and numbers that's the wallet, right?
That's exactly right. And this is why we see in the recent FATF guidance document and from various international regulators this push to apply those KYC, CDD, and EDD controls to the different operators in the virtual space. And so the idea here is that we're going to move from this anonymous space into one which is regulated and transparent. So we're seeing that movement, but currently the environment is still very mixed, and so that risk is very present.
Well, it's interesting. I think it hit so quickly. I'm sure regulators in a lot of places were not prepared for it. So you have places like Hong Kong where it's fairly well regulated, Japan it's fairly well regulated, places like China where it's completely banned, and then other places where it sort of just works in an open morass and people maybe use it, maybe can't use it, but if there is an exchange within those country borders, there are no real controls around that exchange. And I guess the problem seems to me, I'd be interested in your thoughts, is that it's a global asset. There is cross-border risk because a Bitcoin in Russia is worth the same as a Bitcoin in the U.S. is worth the same as a Bitcoin in Hong Kong or Singapore, but the controls around how you can get out of it into fiat currency are different in each country.
That's right, and that's really the key issue is how do you transition from your virtual currency into what they call a fiat currency, like the U.S. dollar. And this is actually where U.S. investigators tend to focus. They look at the movement of the virtual currency, and then they try to identify the touch points with the traditional financial system. And once those are found, they're able to pursue those investigations using their normal tools for investigations. And if you saw the indictment of the 2 Chinese nationals who helped to launder the funds that were stolen from different virtual exchanges on behalf of North Korea, this was one of the issues that was discussed. Both of the individuals had bank accounts at traditional banks in China, and they were able to use those accounts in order to convert that virtual currency and move it into the traditional financial system. And that's where the investigators were able to focus. And so whenever we have that intersection of the new economy and the traditional economy, that's a really fertile area for enforcement actions and investigation.
And do you think that countries will start to coalesce around a standard, or do you think it will take something like OFAC or FATF driving policy in a given direction?
I think it's going to be the standard setters that are going to manage the conversation. I think FATF is going to play a very important role, as it always has. And I think there's going to be certain countries that are going to take a more aggressive stance on the issue. The United States, obviously, is already there. There's a relatively high degree of regulation in the United States in this area, and obviously the investigations focus is there. So I think it's going to be, on the one hand, international standard setters who are going to help us coalesce around some recommendations, and then key regulators who are really going to enforce those in a practical sense.
I think we find it, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it, but I think we find that anyway with general financial crime compliance regulatory rules, a lot of times it's led by FATF, it's led by the US or the EU, HMT in the UK. Then it's picked up in Hong Kong, in Singapore, in Australia, and then regionally, all of the regulators start to follow those leads. And I think, the MAS, the HKMA, the SFC have that sort of role where as they start to implement new policies, in this case, it would most likely be the SFC leading into Hong Kong, but the regional regulators would start to follow their lead as well.
I think that's right. What's interesting in this space is that we do have regulators in the region, particularly in places like Singapore, who have played a leading role in the development of this technology in a lot of ways. And so when I'm trying to get up to speed, when I'm trying to understand what the market is like, I often look to those jurisdictions for my information because I know they're advanced in that area.
So in terms of thinking about what are next steps, and this really isn't only the crypto exchanges, it's also the financial institutions that are considering dealing with crypto exchanges, any corporates that are considering taking cryptocurrencies as payment. What sort of, controls should they be thinking about putting in place?
Sure. So let's look at this from two perspectives. Let's look at it from the perspective of the virtual asset service provider. Let's say it's a cryptocurrency exchange or a wallet provider. And let's also look at it from the perspective of a financial institution, a traditional financial institution. So let's assume that everybody wants to do the right thing and they want to take a proactive approach to compliance.
Of course, everybody always does.
They say they do. They're, in my opinion, going to approach this pretty much like anybody would approach an AML or a sanctions issue. So first of all, KYC controls, you've got to know who your customers are. You've got to do due diligence and, in some cases, enhanced due diligence. From the sanctions perspective, it's all about name screening and making sure that you're not transacting in a prohibited manner with sanctioned territories. That's really key, and that requires some location-based controls like IP blocking and geolocators and things of that nature. From the financial institution's perspective, I like to think of it like a money service business. You have a similar issue here. You want to operate an account for a company, but you're not exactly sure who they're doing business with, and you don't know exactly what's going to go through that account. And so what you focus on is the strength of their internal controls, making sure that they're following the regulations and making sure that they're following best practices so that you're comfortable with them as a customer. And that's a kind of due diligence that you repeat periodically, and of course you monitor the account. But banks know how to do that with other types of customers, and I think increasingly they're getting comfortable with crypto providers by following that traditional model of due diligence.
Yeah, it's interesting. We use the example of sort of correspondent banking.
Yeah.
Of, the same way that you have to do due diligence on their due diligence process, on their policies and all of that, that you have to do the same, when you're a financial institution dealing with a VAS. From the VAS perspective, it's really interesting that you mention about technology and location and IP. We actually last week in the webinar were talking about IP blocking. We had a question on that, and it's a very interesting approach because the good thing about digital is that although it's sort of pseudo-anonymous, even the technology side is pseudo-anonymous because you never know who's sitting in front of the keyboard on the other side. you can do a lot of tracking, a lot more tracking than you can do, say, versus phone banking or something like that. And so we find on the location front that you can manage the location, but not only that, but that if you know that a specific device or a specific IP address, that you can manage other risky wallets or exchange accounts connected to that IP address, connected to that device, and you can control more through that than you can through, say, even an in-person or a phone banking account.
Sure, and again, that's the interesting thing about this digital environment, is that on the one hand it has a reputation for being anonymous. On the other hand, once you get familiar with it, you realize that there's actually a lot of information that you can use to understand who you're dealing with. And the basic rule, and we're going to look at some cases in a little bit that highlight this, from an OFAC perspective, especially U.S. persons, U.S. companies, if they have information in their possession that indicates that they're transacting with someone in a sanctioned territory, they have an obligation to do something with that information. And so as regulators increasingly understand the controls that are available to companies, they're going to expect them to use those controls. And that might be IP blocking, but I think increasingly it will be more sophisticated ways of identifying location.
Yeah, we're seeing that more and more, is working to find more sophisticated ways, not only to find out the location, but what are the other devices, what are the other assets, what are the other exchange accounts that they're controlling?
Yeah, absolutely. It's just like in a bank. If you identify one account, you need to understand the full scope of the relationship. It's just basic principles.
Yeah. Well, I think what's really interesting about OFAC and OFAC sanctions and the extraterritoriality of it is that a lot of people think it's purely about money. It's purely about dollars. And as we found out recently, it's not. And we're going to talk about dollars. Don't worry. It is a key point, and it is a very interesting aspect of it. But before we get to that, OFAC has found a new way to enforce sanctions, which is incredibly interesting, still has a U.S. nexus, but is not money-based necessarily. We discussed before this, obviously, CITA, the Société Internationale de Télécommunications Aéronautique, SCARL.
Très bien, très bien.
Thank you very much. That took all of my years of French to get that out. It's an aeronautics information company who dealt with airlines in sanctioned countries, is based in Switzerland. However, because of their U.S. software and their U.S. servers, pulled themselves into OFAC's jurisdiction. It's interesting because it really had nothing to do with financial transactions. Obviously, these airlines paid for the transactions, but they provided a service that was not money-based.
Right, and this is a really fascinating case. I think you can go online and read about it on OFAC's website if you're interested, but let me give you the basic details. So CITA is based in Switzerland. As you mentioned, it's a service provider, mainly software services to airlines. Some of its member airlines included Syrian and Iranian airlines that were designated as specially designated global terrorists. So it's not only an SDN airline, but specifically designated under the terrorism regulations. And the issue here was that CITA had identified that it had these relationships. It had identified that they were utilizing certain products that had a nexus to the United States, and it took steps to try to limit that access, but it overlooked some services. Now, when it comes to these airlines, the U.S. has a general policy of aggressively applying the sanctions in respect of the airlines, and so that was one of the reasons behind this particular case. And what they found, what OFAC found, was that CITA was providing access or providing access for the benefit of these sanctioned airlines. And the software either came from the United States, it was U.S. origin, or it was processed through servers which were based in the United States. And that's the part that I find the most interesting, because as you said, it's not based on financial transactions. It's based on where the data is processed. And using that as a jurisdictional hook, OFAC brought this enforcement case against the organization. So imagine whether we're talking about cryptocurrency exchanges or we're talking about financial institutions or any other company that is either using U.S.-based servers or U.S. origin software for its business with persons in sanctioned territories or even SDN. They could have this potential exposure. And I think not only is OFAC signaling with this case that they're increasingly looking at data, but I think we should also understand that OFAC is getting more sophisticated. It understands data. They know how servers work, and they expect companies to have sophisticated controls in order to limit access to sanctioned persons when they provide these types of services. So I think this is a key enforcement case. It reflects principles we see in other earlier cases. We'll talk about some of those, but I think this one really drives the message home.
And please tell me if I'm wrong, but being that the servers are in the United States, I assume that OFAC or the DOJ have subpoena power to take those servers to confirm, yes, you're actually doing this illegal business or this sanctioned business.
Right. That's definitely one of the ways that they can discover it. Most of these cases will arise from self-disclosures, but CETA actually didn't. This was based, I understand, on an information request from OFAC because they understood that these airlines were member airlines of the organization. So it can happen both ways, but in the United States, definitely the DOJ certainly has the power to subpoena data, emails, and all sorts of other information that's within the U.S. territory.
So it's very interesting, and I think very important for obviously all of you sitting here in the APAC region who may or may not be working for U.S. companies, may or may not be U.S. persons, naturally, as Nick and I both are, that nexus to the United States is increasing in scope pretty much every day. OFAC is going to, if you're doing business with Syria, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, Crimea, OFAC is going to look for a way to find a U.S. nexus so that they can stop you from doing it or prosecute you or come to a settlement with you on doing business with people in one of those countries.
Right. And one other point that I would add is, let's say you have some services which are hosted on the cloud, or you have some internet-based service. Why don't you go look at the service agreement? Because I guarantee that if it's a U.S. company that's providing that, they probably have a provision that prohibits you from providing access to those services to sanctioned persons. So it's not only that risk with the U.S. government, you might have some commercial risk with your contracts.
Yeah, using someone like Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure, they have to follow all of OFAC sanctioned protocols, and so by using their service, you'd be required to use them as well.
Yep, that's absolutely.
It's incredibly interesting because we often think the first thought that people have about sanctions is U.S. persons and U.S. companies, U.S. branches or branches of U.S. companies. The next thing that people think about, the sort of first derivative of that, is U.S. dollar transactions that are going through the U.S. financial system. It's not necessarily just U.S. dollars. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But to have to think now about where do the electrons that make up my connections to the internet go through, I wouldn't be surprised if one day OFAC is just looking purely at, say, email internet connections. What IP addresses did it hit on its way from one company to another? Did it connect to a U.S. server at some place along the way? And then they'll bring that into a U.S. nexus as well.
It's a possibility. And it's something, when you think about this from a compliance perspective, you should always be thinking in a risk-based manner. So if your company has business with sanctioned territories or with SDNs, that might be perfectly okay under the laws of the country where you're operating. But you need to be aware of where these touch points are. And so when you're performing your OFAC risk assessment, you look for the U.S. financial system, obviously, but increasingly you need to start thinking about these other touch points with the United States, which could cause OFAC to have jurisdiction. And think creatively so that you identify them as comprehensively as possible.
Yeah. Well, so then moving on to something that might be a little closer to home for people who are on this call, although I did see there were a number of people from corporates on the phone. Moving into the financial institution space, there's just recently been a case as well with TD Bank in the U.S. for violations of security trades with people in sanctions jurisdictions. Can you give a bit of background on the case, please?
Sure. So this one was easy to overlook. There was a settlement with TD Bank and some of its affiliates, and tucked away near the bottom of the document, there was this finding of violation. So there was no financial penalty associated with it. OFAC was more or less just pointing out that they had found a violation and they wanted the public to know. Now, the issue here is that TD Bank had affiliates in Luxembourg and the United Kingdom, and they were providing security services to individuals, so basically an online trading platform like many of you have used before. And they were offering this to individuals who were in Iran and Cuba. So the individuals were accessing the service from the sanctioned territories. Now, when the trades were placed, they were placed through a U.S. broker-dealer. And when the broker-dealer received the instructions, they were in the names of the affiliates, not of the ultimate customers. And this is actually a pattern that we see in a lot of cases involving securities. It's where the beneficial owner of a security or the ultimate customer involved in a trade is not transparent enough. It's not known to the U.S. persons who are executing the trade who they're doing it for. And that becomes a problem. So from OFAC's point of view, when this happens, the non-U.S. company, which is providing access to the U.S. broker-dealer, is exporting U.S. services to individuals in sanctioned territories. That's how they frame it in a legal way. And what they say, and what makes this so interesting from a compliance perspective, is that OFAC wants companies, U.S. companies and non-U.S. companies, that provide access to online platforms. It could be for payments, it could be for cryptocurrencies, it could be for securities, to make sure that they have some kind of location control in place. In this example, IP blocking was what they pointed out, in order to prevent individuals or entities in sanctioned territories from accessing the U.S. financial system. So very basic principle, but it can be kind of tricky in practice to implement those controls. But this case and other cases like it highlight why that's so important. And again, it drives home that message that OFAC is pretty sophisticated. They understand how these products work, and they have certain expectations for how companies are going to manage that risk.
So what we found was very interesting internally here at LNRS was in our digital database for our clients, I believe the top 9 clients had over 250,000 pings from IP addresses in Cuba and Iran over the course of Q1 2020, which means that either, and these are people not using VPNs, these are people not using proxies, these are direct pings of websites. This means, I think, that IP location blocking or IP blocking is not necessarily as prevalent as it needs to be. And for this risk with, you're taking on sanctions risk with OFAC, if you don't do something about it, you need to be looking at IPs at a minimum.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is especially true if the platforms that you're offering rely on a U.S. person, like a U.S. company, in order to offer the service. This is true with a lot of securities platforms. Again, if you look at your agreement, if it's a service provider, there's probably a provision in there that requires you to have these controls. A lot of companies in Asia, haven't tuned in yet to what that means, but this is an example of what they should be doing.
Yeah. What we've started to do with some of those clients is look at who is pinging them from those IP addresses and then raising those for further investigation, because you have to be doing that. You have to be blocking them. And then if they come back and try and use a VPN, you know which VPNs they're using, and you know the risk of that VPN, that potentially other sanctions evaders are using those VPNs. There's really a lot that you need to and can be doing in that space.
Right, absolutely. And there was a recent case actually that highlighted this. There was a company in Iran, and its whole purpose was to provide individuals in Iran with PayPal accounts and other access to services so they could order things from the United States on the internet. And what happened was the founder of the company traveled to London, and there was a warrant, an international warrant for his arrest, and so he was arrested and sent to the United States to be charged. So it was, again, an example where OFAC is focused on this issue. That's the DOJ in this case. The U.S. is focused on this issue, and it's something they're concerned with. So what's the practical thing to do? So let's say that you have you've got this data. You see that you've got a lot of pings, from sanctioned territories involving your customers. Well, one of the easy steps you can take is to look at the KYC and say, do I have any indication here that this individual actually resides in a sanctioned territory? Is that consistent with the KYC? Do I have a local address or do I have a foreign address? So on and so on. And you try to reconcile that information with what you're seeing. If the case is, the person was living maybe as a student or a temporary worker in your country, they opened an account, and then they moved back to a sanctioned territory, and now they're using it online, well, that's a problem, because not only is your KYC inaccurate, but if they're using the U.S. financial system, then you might have some exposure from an OFAC point of view. So, KYC is often key.
We're definitely trying to use this type of information, these insights with our clients, to allow them to find solutions for these problems. I guess even before they find solutions, investigate the problems, understand the issue. Is it just that somebody's gone on holiday to, someone's from Iran and they've gone back to Iran and they realized, I got to pay my rent this month? Or is it somebody has opened an account and moved back to Iran and now is trying to do business through that account from Iran? And then from there, raise to them the ability to block it and the need to block it and the need to block it if they come back using a VPN, however they might do in the future. And you sort of, it's the same as KYC. You put the onus back on the client to sort of show that they are not committing illegal acts. They're not evading U.S. sanctions.
Right, exactly. And, when you approach these questions, again, it's a risk-based approach. And so not every case is the same. OFAC actually has a certain degree of tolerance when it comes to individuals who are just doing normal activity. They understand that people travel. Where you really have some risk, though, is when you're dealing with, say, a corporate that is accessing the U.S. financial system from a sanctioned territory, particularly if it's engaged in direct trade with that territory. That could present some really significant risk from an OFAC point of view because of the commercial nature of the activity. And so when you see something like that and it involves a corporate account, that's a good time to take a close look and try to understand if there's some risk.
Yeah. So taking that to sort of a broader perspective, the OFAC risk and the extraterritoriality risk, it's not U.S. dollar risk. You can trade U.S. dollars with someone from Iran. There's no risk in that if you're just handing dollars back and forth. The risk is really that nexus to the United States. And as we discussed before, it's no longer the U.S. financial system, but it's still primarily the U.S. financial system. So I think that there are a number of ways that risk manifests itself that people don't think about. U.S. dollar transactions between two non-U.S. countries may transfer through the United States financial system. A currency exchange that doesn't involve U.S. dollars, I don't think a lot of people realize that when you convert Hong Kong dollars to Singapore dollars, the bank in the background is actually converting Hong Kong dollars to U.S. dollars and then U.S. dollars to Singapore dollars. And if that happens through a U.S. financial institution, probably in the U.S., that there's sanctions risk there. And so what are some of those ways that risk manifests itself that sort of are broader than just a U.S. individual or a U.S. company?
Sure. So let me explain this a little bit in kind of legal terms, just to make it clear. So there's a common misperception that OFAC has jurisdiction over U.S. dollars. And that's not actually true. What OFAC has jurisdiction over is things that happen in the United States and things which are done by U.S. persons. Now, the idea of U.S. person and U.S. territory can kind of be extrapolated into this description of the U.S. financial system, which is actually based on the legal vehicles who are involved in a transaction, not actually the currency that's involved. So let me explain. There's 5 elements to the U.S. financial system. And if you've taken one of my trainings, you've heard this before. It's U.S. banks. It's the overseas branches of U.S. banks. It is the U.S.-based branches of non-U.S. banks. So, for example, a Chinese or a Singapore or Australian bank that has a branch in New York, that branch is part of the U.S. financial system. It's U.S.-based correspondent accounts, and that's the big one. And then finally, for the purposes of the Iran, Cuba, and North Korea sanctions, it also includes overseas entities which are owned or controlled by U.S. persons or U.S. financial institutions. So if you think of those 5 elements in practice, you can see how we could have a tangled web of legal vehicles all over the world, which technically are part of the U.S. financial system. And what that means is that you have to comply with OFAC regulations when you're transacting with one of those legal vehicles. Now, notice that when I was describing what the U.S. financial system is, I never had to use the word U.S. dollar. The fact is, you could have a transaction in any currency, and if it passes through one of those 5 elements, then you're with the U.S. financial system, and you have to follow OFAC regulations. So imagine that you had a euro transaction with Citibank NA in London, which is a branch of Citibank. That euro transaction would have to comply with OFAC regulations. But as you were mentioning, if you had a U.S. dollar transaction and it did not involve any of those 5 elements, if it was completely outside of the U.S. financial system, technically OFAC doesn't have jurisdiction. When you start to think of it that way, you realize how complicated this picture is, and you realize that what you need to do from a compliance perspective is stop looking so much for U.S. dollars. It's a good rule of thumb because so many of them go through the U.S. financial system, but try to think more broadly about what are the legal vehicles that you rely on in order to process your transactions, because that's going to give you a better picture of where your OFAC exposure is, and you can anticipate a little bit better what transactions you might need to decline, reject, or to handle differently.
So taking those principles and applying them to a very specific case that's going to hit home for a lot of people out there, including you and I, sitting here in Hong Kong. Obviously in the news, the U.S. government, Donald Trump has come out, Secretary of State Pompeo has come out and talked about Hong Kong, talked about China, talked about the possibility of Hong Kong sanctions. What does this mean? In the broadest of terms, I guess, Hong Kong sanctions.
Sure. So the issue of Hong Kong sanctions has been talked about now for more than a year. And recently what happened, Secretary Pompeo announced that he was going to decertify that Hong Kong was sufficiently autonomous under sufficiently autonomous from mainland China to warrant continued differential treatment under U.S. laws. And he did that under a law called the Hong Kong Policy Act of 1992. And the consequence there is that the United States will start to take steps to revoke Hong Kong's special status under U.S. law. Now, there's a whole separate issue, though, and that's sanctions, because the sanctions can happen regardless of whether or not Hong Kong is treated differently under U.S. law. And we need to focus on the sanctions because the president on May 29th gave a news conference, and he said that we will sanction Chinese and Hong Kong officials who are involved directly or indirectly in the erosion of Hong Kong's autonomy. So that was the president's words. We don't know who those officials are going to be, and we don't know precisely what the sanctions will look like. It could be blocking sanctions, which would freeze their property, or it could be visa bans, where they wouldn't be allowed to enter the United States. We're not sure at this point. What we do know is that the State Department is closely watching for the introduction of the national security law, which is anticipated as early as this week. And they're also watching what happens with the September LegCo elections in Hong Kong. So based on those two events, the United States will make some decisions about whether or not it's going to apply sanctions and who those sanctions will be against. Now, here's why it matters. There's basically 4 laws that exist that would allow sanctions in respect of Hong Kong. I'll go through them super quickly. The first is the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which was passed last year. It allows for human rights-related sanctions against persons in Hong Kong or China. Second, the Global Magnitsky sanctions. It's exactly the same. Both of those would have blocking sanctions. So property of those individuals would be frozen, and they would not be allowed to transact with the U.S. financial system. The third example is an appropriations bill for the State Department, which would allow for visa bans against officials who were found to be involved in human rights abuses, but it also applies to their immediate family members, so spouses and kids. So that could have a big impact on some Hong Kong or Chinese officials, depending on if they have something to do in the United States. Now, the fourth one, which I think is worth watching, is called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. And this basically allows the president to create sanctions out of thin air. And I think that for the Hong Kong autonomy issue, this is probably the most likely tool because it's the most flexible. It could allow, for example, for comprehensive sanctions like we see against Crimea, but I think that's highly unlikely. I can't imagine that happening. What's more likely is that there would be blocking sanctions against individuals or specific entities, or there could even be something like sectoral sanctions against certain entities in China or Hong Kong, and that could include secondary sanctions against financial institutions. So depending on how this situation evolves, there could be some very intricate, detailed sanctions that companies in Hong Kong and elsewhere will need to comply with. And because Hong Kong has so many entities which are part of the U.S. financial system, that includes U.S. banks, their overseas branches, their subsidiaries of U.S.-based companies, that could get very complicated, and it's going to require companies in Hong Kong to apply their sanctions compliance controls very carefully. So it's an interesting area to watch for. We don't know exactly what's going to happen yet. The sanctions will probably be targeted, but for companies that have exposure to those individuals or entities, this is potentially, a very complicated situation for them.
It's a bit of watch this space because it's so new and it's so unknown at this point.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, sort of moving on to putting it all together, I guess in terms of summarizing all of the various points, we covered a wide range of topics, but it's the U.S. It's not only the U.S. financial system anymore. It's really anything that touches anything in America that you need to be careful of as you manage your sanctions risk. And it's no longer just transactions, as we saw with the CETA case. There's also, where does your data go through? Where does your technology go through? Where do you keep your servers? Where do you buy your software? OFAC is expanding their, I guess, not so much remit, but the tools they have at their disposal to be able to deliver U.S. sanctions policy.
Right, that's exactly right. And, if you think of it from the point of view of a compliance officer in a company in Asia, I think this probably sounds pretty overwhelming, right? Because now not only do you have to be familiar with all those complicated rules and regulations and guidance documents, but now you have to start thinking about legal vehicles and data and servers and things that you might not be comfortable talking about on a day-to-day basis. Well, it's a good opportunity, go find your IT person, knock on the door, and have a conversation about how the data is processed. Yeah. Talk to your operations team or your business team. Try to learn who you're transacting with and whether or not that's a part of the U.S. financial system. This is an opportunity to learn. There are some very clear guidelines for what you should be looking for, and it's, as you said, it's the U.S. territory. It's U.S. persons, and in some cases, it's subsidiaries of U.S. companies. And once you've found those touch points, it's not that hard to start thinking about how am I going to control risk. There's some basic procedures that you can use. You have the capability to do IP blocking or more sophisticated geolocation controls, and you should really start thinking about those, depending on your risk, because as you said, OFAC is starting to look in this direction as a way of enhancing the effect of U.S. sanctions globally. So that's the trend, and it's a big task, but it's one that we're all here to help each other learn and to find the best practices.
We are always advocates of compliance departments going out and building bridges to other departments. Most of the time we talk about the business lines because that's the people you end up interacting with the most. But you should also be speaking to the IT department, as you mentioned. Fraud department often has a significant amount of information, and a lot of it is near real time. So the opportunity to use their data will lead to insights that you wouldn't have had previously. And of course, don't forget to go out and talk to your lawyers about it and what your legal risk is. This is the perfect time to remind you that nothing here should be construed as legal advice unless you are Nick's client. He cannot be providing you legal advice, and I certainly am not either. As we move into our final key takeaways, a reminder that we are taking questions for the last 10 minutes. So if you do have any questions, please put them into the On24 desktop, and we will try to get back to you. If we can't get back to you, we will respond over email to you. I guess key takeaways: sanctions risk management is no longer about just doing periodic screening of SDN lists, doing periodic transaction monitoring. You need to be looking at this risk every day, all the time. If you can do it in near real time, that's even better. But you need to be all over this all the time.
Yeah. You've got to understand where your risk is, and you've got to have dynamic controls.
Yeah. And then just risk-based due diligence. It's not about implementing a checklist. Checking boxes has never solved sanctions evasion. And so it's about understanding your risk, doing the due diligence, making sure you understand your touch points to the U.S. That's really the key thing in all of this, I think.
Right, that's exactly right. It's what we were saying earlier.
Yeah.
It's about getting comfortable with different topics and making sure that you really understand how your business works.
And finally, and most importantly, compliance officers have to be comfortable. It says should, but you really have to be comfortable with data and information, because the analytics that come from it will be invaluable for your role. And the more comfortable you are with data, the more you can advance what your company is doing, and quite frankly, what you're doing within your company.
Yep, that's exactly right.
And so, Mary, I guess with that, we'd be happy to pass it back over to you for the final 10 minutes to discuss Q&A.
Thank you very much to both Doug and Nick for those presentations. And to our viewers, very quickly, we apologize if you've had issues with video lagging. We will send you a link to today's recording in the next few days, just in case you missed any of it today. And we do urge you to use the strongest internet connection you have available to view that recording. So now it is time for our Q&A session. Type your questions into the Q&A box and then hit the submit button. We'll get to as many questions as we can today. First question's for you, Nick. Let's see. Do you think that the FATF travel rule will be globally adopted? And if so, what would be the timeline?
Well, if it's a FATF recommendation, I think the expectation is that all FATF members and members of FATF-style regional bodies would implement that in accordance with the recommendations. I don't have a timeline, but those issues are always being improved over time in the context of the mutual evaluation process. But I think it's a common sense rule. I think it helps financial institutions have equal access to information about transactions. I think it supports the investigations process, and there are key regulators in the United States and elsewhere who, for a long time, have mandated something like the travel rule. So I do think that we're heading in that direction.
Yeah, look, I think at the end of the day, most countries will end up implementing the vast majority of FATF rules.
Yeah.
They have to, otherwise it ends up as negative marks in the mutual evaluation,
exactly
which is
right.
You never want to end up there, right? So,
right.
Thank you, Shahada, for that. Did we finish there? Okay, great. So, Shahada, thanks for that question. Glad to have it from you. And also, here's one again for you, Nick. This is from Wayne. What is the whistleblowing channels for OFAC? Right.
So OFAC has a lot of different ways of learning about potential cases. So I'll list some examples. OFAC cases have begun with media reports. So a Reuters story, for example, led to a major sanctions investigation. It can be competitors who decide to blow the whistle on their competition and provide information to OFAC. It can be U.S. Borders and Customs agents who discover something entering or leaving the United States that shouldn't. It's financial institutions who submit self-disclosures or rejected or blocked transaction reports that identify parties who are involved in sanctioned activity. It is other governments who provide information to the United States that they can use for investigations. And it also includes self-disclosures by companies when they find that there's been an OFAC violation. There's a page on OFAC's website where you can make a self-disclosure. OFAC encourages that. They like to say that 95% of self-disclosures do not result in a public enforcement action. Many of them are closed out with no action at all. But the basic idea here is that OFAC has many, many channels through which it gets information that could lead to an enforcement case or a prosecution. So if somebody is thinking of getting into some risky business and they think that they're not going to get caught, it's probably not true.
There's a high likelihood. I think OFAC tries to make it as easy as possible, and I think there is a general understanding that, look, sanctions evasions happen, right? Like this is something that unfortunately is going on, and so they understand that if you've done everything that you can and you've made an effort to block people from using your service or your financial institution or whatever it might be to evade sanctions, if you've done everything that you could to try to stop it along the way, there will be some level of leniency to their approach.
And there's just one other point I want to raise that's come up a lot recently, which is the Patriot Act, Section 319B. This has been in the news because it gives the United States the ability to subpoena records held outside the United States by financial institutions that have correspondent accounts in the United States in relation to transactions through those correspondent accounts. So there was a very big case last year involving 3 Chinese banks that resisted answering those subpoenas in respect of a customer in Hong Kong that was acting as a front company for North Korea and processing transactions through the U.S. financial system. Now, the U.S. courts held that the banks must respond to those subpoenas that are authorized under the Patriot Act and other areas of U.S. law. So the takeaway there is that if you're a bank and you have a correspondent account or a branch in the United States, the U.S. can get information about your customers in Hong Kong or anywhere else, and that's another reason to apply excellent OFAC controls, due diligence, and monitoring, because really you don't want to be on the receiving end of one of those subpoenas or to have your financial institution become the target of an investigation.
Thank you very much. Doug, this one's for you. You know, goods and products need to go through multiple channels of production or assembly before they reach their final location. What do you think would be the optimal sanction screening to mitigate such complex supply chain processes in a cost-effective way?
So this is fairly straightforward one, actually, despite the difficulty and length of the question. That sanction screening has to be done at every single level of the production supply chain. From producer to compiler to the finished product, at every level, the sanction screening has to be done on the vendors at the level before in which they've gotten these supplies from. There is no scope for, say, at the end of the day, take a large company, take Apple, gets parts manufactured all over the world. There is no scope for Apple to take parts, a part that's part of a component that's part of an iPhone that was produced in Iran or Cuba or North Korea. There's simply, well, North Korea for multiple reasons, but there's no scope for that whatsoever. So that screening needs to be done at each level to make sure that all the suppliers throughout the supply chain are compliant. And additionally, the ultimate vendor of the product, in this case Apple, should be doing sanction screening on all of the vendors in the supply chain, so they know for sure that that supply chain is clean and there's no sanctions evasions as part of it.
Right. If I were to add anything to that, it's that OFAC is very focused on supply chain due diligence. They released a guidance on this in respect of North Korea. There was an enforcement case involving a U.S. cosmetics retailer that had sold products in the United States that contained material from North Korea. But also, the issue of supply chain due diligence also brings into the picture the entity list, which is a Commerce Department list. The rules are a little bit complicated. They're different than OFAC sanctions, but that's another area where we're all having to learn, especially those of us that do business with companies on the entity list, because we need to know how those rules apply to the products that we're selling to them or purchasing.
Yeah.
Thank you, Doug. It is time for your final comments, but I'd love you to squeeze in an answer to this question, too. What do you think the biggest misconception is on sanctions compliance?
I think the biggest misconception is that it's a burden on a company. Certainly there's work that goes through it, but by being compliant with sanctions, it means that you're helping to stop individuals who may have committed war crimes, individuals who might be drug dealers, who have run drug cartels, people who may have run human trafficking rings. You are stopping them from being able to do their business, for them to be able to bring their ill to the world, and to stop rogue regimes from being able to, continue to perpetrate their crimes. And I think, you don't have to look any further than a place like North Korea to see all the difficulty that they're bringing in the world, and know that it's good to follow these sanctions regimes. In terms of closing, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that, but
No,
in terms of closing remarks, I want to thank everybody for joining. If you've joined all three of our webinars, a special thank you. A thank you to Nick, who's come today, who, as I mentioned earlier, always enjoy speaking with Nick about sanctions. Thank you very much for joining us. Apologies if you've had some technical difficulties. We will hopefully, the video was recorded on the main servers, and we will be able to get you copies of the video. So if you want to see our beautiful faces, you will be able to. And we will be sending out the slides as well. In fact, we will be sending out, given how much information there was, we will be sending out a more detailed version of the slides that we used today. Just a reminder, next Thursday, June 25th, we are exploring the global cost of financial crime compliance with my London colleague, Nina Kirkez. And on July 2nd, navigating the new regulatory expectations for virtual asset service providers with my colleague in Sydney, Cameron Church. Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you also to you, Nick, for these presentations. Thanks again to our audience. We will definitely send you a tape, the recording of today's event, and we are asking once again that you fill out the short survey before you leave today's event. And as Doug said, there are new Lexis Risk Solutions webinar sessions scheduled every week on the latest financial crime compliance-related topics. So look for our invites and join us. Once again, thank you, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Okay, we're done.